Hi, I'm Dr. Joe Hall-Patton, or Cypher on this channel, and I've made my belief in HistoryTube quite clear, despite the many hindrances from Team YouTube's suppression of educational content and the many bigots on this platform who support suppressing history. Despite all of that, there's one more impediment that I haven't spoken of. Institutional opposition to joining the fight on this platform, to the point of antagonizing us. So I decided to do something about that, especially as a historian with the insider know-how to navigate institutional bias. This wasn't my first attempt at assailing the ivory tower in the name of HistoryTube. We first put together a panel for the National Council on Public History in 2020, but that went digital for the first week of the pandemic, so no one watched from NCPH. I did publish it later, but it didn't have the effect I wanted it to. This time, I chaired the panel. The message was heard loud and clear. HistoryTube is here, and we are the new face of public history. So that's what today is. I've taken that presentation and turned it into a video, so hopefully historians who want to make a difference will have some sort of inspiration. And for everyone else, you'll understand the larger aspirations of why I do what I do on HistoryTube. A couple years ago, I attended a summer workshop run by Patricia Limerick to show historians how they can apply history to the present. Patty was fond of defining applied history as a historian coming into a given fraught situation and saying, "I'm a historian and I'm here to help." She showed us numerous ways of applying history to the present, such as op-eds for various newspapers, or using historic site markers to get people to realize that they are more connected to history, even though they might view it as a distant past. So a lot of applied history is a historian coming into a given situation and using that history to apply it to the present and show that we are more connected to the past than ever. Which is exactly what I try to do on YouTube as well. For there is this common misconception that Americans are ignorant of their history. It's all too common to have some sort of talk show go and interview random Americans on the street and then make fun of the fact that they don't know very simple things about history. It's so much of a trope, I've done it myself. But Americans participate in our own ways. The Academy has often lost sight of what Carl Becker said all the way back in 1931 when he called every man his own historian. He was then president of the American Historical Association, which at that point the National Council on Public History was a part of. And this idea is that every American has their own view of history that can not only be influenced by us, but in turn can influence and benefit our own understandings. Many decades later, in the edited volume Presence of the Past, Roy Rosenzweig illustrates that there was significant popular involvement in history and suggests that the internet would become the great unifier, and he was doing so way back in 1998. He said, "Historians have interested, active, and thoughtful audiences for what we want to talk about. The deeper challenge is finding out how we can talk to, and especially with, those audiences." And YouTube has become the primary place to do so. But, of course, misinformation and disinformation abounds. On the internet, peddling falsehoods about history is somewhat of a moneymaker. So rather than engage with that, many historians have shied away from the internet altogether, especially where some of these falsehoods are most prevalent, which is YouTube. Many in the academy and in major institutions don't consider YouTube to be part of public history, so our definition has become too narrow. Documentarians have long been a staple at the National Council on Public History, and yet this panel and the one that I tried to put together before this are the first to actually attempt to deal with history on YouTube. If public history is also about accessibility to information, then YouTube is the most accessible. And we cannot mitigate the problems of the platform by ignoring it. As attendance to museums and other such public history outlets dwindles, HistoryTube, on the other hand, a portmanteau of history on YouTube, has gained a greater and greater share of people interested in history. A common complaint from folks is, why does history matter to me? And applied history can answer that question. This is how we can get more people interested in history, participating in the method, and yearning for even more. YouTube is the second largest search platform after Google, its parent company, and roughly a third of the world are users. This is the place where people come to learn about history and formulate their opinions on the matter. The public history profession only does damage to itself by ignoring HistoryTube. But there are barriers to entry. First and foremost is technological proficiency. Now, this barrier has been lowered significantly as tech has become more and more cheap and prolific. You can get started with literally just your cell phone. As you can see here, this is my setup along with my cat, King Richard I, who often makes his appearance in episodes because he chooses to. But beyond that, it will also require some sort of editing software. I use the Adobe suite with Premiere Pro, Audition, and Photoshop, and an ability to navigate the internet for finding necessary imagery. That imagery leads us to the next hurdle, which is entertainment. You have to be somewhat entertaining in order to get people to go along with your stories. It takes time to figure that out, but the nice thing about YouTube is you get to figure it out the hard way by making those mistakes. Even when lecturing in my class, I always try to throw around a couple of jokes just to make sure that they're paying attention and drag them along the way. If you can get a class to laugh, they'll pay attention. But admittedly, even after a decade on this platform, I still struggle with being entertaining as well, which can get people rather angry, which is the final hurdle: hateful communities. No matter what kind of history you want to propound, you will run into denialists. They should not have a place in a conversation in which they refuse to engage with, which is why I have a policy of banning bigots, but simply explaining history in any way will bring out these kinds of hateful people. You have to kind of grow a thick skin. That's why I take great pleasure in banning these people. It's fun. But different history tubers will have different policies on that. Because of these kinds of hateful communities, I've seen many people of color and women come and go on HistoryTube, and they are constantly hounded because of their marginalized identities. So all of these are significant barriers to entry, but the key is to get started at least. Once you get started, you can figure out what to do along the way. And once you reach a certain point with your channel, we have support networks in order to bring you into the larger HistoryTube community and discuss all of the different problems of doing it. And there's one key piece of advice that basically every YouTuber gets when they're starting, and while it seems like a platitude, it does explain kind of how YouTube works, which is find your niche and be authentic. History as a whole could be considered a niche, but that's becoming less and less feasible, so all of us have specific specialities, so that can become your niche. And being authentic normally just means being yourself, but here it also means displaying your expertise through video content. Once you get started, you can make mistakes, and learn to overcome these hurdles and make a better channel in the process. While you're doing so, you will build a reputation. You will become known not just on YouTube, but throughout the internet for whatever your niche is. And in the process of that, you will become a better historian. The process of making history on YouTube and making history elsewhere are symbiotic. And one way of using your speciality is by applying history to the present, which is especially useful on YouTube given some of these hurdles. You can leverage all the craziness online to make history. My primary goal is to facilitate continued learning. Everything on my channel serves that purpose. And I often use all the online hate and denialism that I receive in order to make history. One very popular way is historical myth-busting. Myths are the stories we tell in order to inform our identities. It isn't necessarily false, but in the popular consciousness, it is. And those specific myths are the ones that I'll go after. My breakout viral hit as a history tuber was a video called 10 Common Slavery Myths, where I briefly debunked several myths. Negativity sells, but can also be used to make a positive difference. By busting myths, you can show a new narrative for them to engage with and facilitate continued learning. So I've made a bit of a series out of myth busting. I've had 2 other 10 myths busting ones, which were Soviet myths and American founding myths, as well as looking at very specific American myths, such as the frontier myth and the lost cause myth. All of these were extraordinarily popular videos, but popularity isn't exactly a good measure about whether or not you are facilitating continued learning. Simply debunking stuff doesn't mean that people want to go further, especially if they hold those myths dearly. Ultimately, debunking is negative, as in it reduces overall consideration of history, rather than creating new understandings. Debunking can only tangentially fulfill my ultimate goal. And that's why myth-busting is not the only way I apply history to the present. Much of my videos are applied history simply by trying to embrace difficult topics in order to gain attention. One such way I regularly do this is through timely history. I have a whole series called Based on a True Story, which reviews historical movies and sometimes TV shows in order to show the reality behind them, the scholarship, and the accuracies and inaccuracies. By bringing in new and popular topics, many people will go on to want to learn more, and that will facilitate continued learning. I always include a bibliography below, which include links to the books that I am referring to. I actually have metrics in terms of the number of people clicking on those links, and even if I only get a couple of people to go down and read some of those books, it does show that I am facilitating continued learning. And beyond movie reviews, there's major anniversaries and events that you can use in order to bring up those particular topics. There's an anniversary of something every single day. For instance, I re-released recently a video about the Armenian Genocide on Armenian Genocide Awareness Day. And once you've published those, you can always publicize them on platforms like Twitter and Facebook anytime an anniversary or event recurs. Another way to embrace difficult history is to shape the public conversation about a particular topic through argument and analysis. On the internet, I'm frequently credited with changing the attitude towards President Woodrow Wilson because I rather famously despise the man. Now, I would argue that he did it to himself, but for the weirdos who want to defend the man and his abhorrent policies, I've become somewhat of enemy number one. But that opposition to Woodrow Wilson isn't purely about just what I think of him as a historical character, but of his effect on the present, specifically through Wilsonianism, an idealistic form of foreign policy, as well as his legacy through the suppression of free speech and federalization of Jim Crow, problems that we still have to deal with today. And by illustrating those things, even though it's kind of just a meme at this point of me going, Wilson, I have been able to shape public conversation through my argument and analysis. Finally, the other way you can embrace difficult history is by reviving awareness of the historical roots for current issues. A few examples I've done recently is make a video about moral panics and where they come from, how race is a social construct, the origin of various wars, and how the US has become politically polarized. I will often apply history to the present by delving into the historical roots of current issues. By doing so, you will gain attention. For YouTube, as Marquez Brownlee once said, is the only S-tier social media platform. It's the only one that is extremely good at proliferating information and maintaining its policies in a way that encourages engagement and is profitable. There are, of course, systemic problems that discourage the making of history. For instance, there is demonetization, where they removed ad support from a video and therefore make it so that you cannot make money on the video. This is normally because the content is supposedly not advertiser friendly, but Team YouTube's definition of that tends to lean towards demonetizing history. Their policies are often so vague that pretty much anything qualifies, especially if it deals with the more important topics, so they financially disincentivize making videos on those topics. Even worse, they can age restrict a video where it requires a user to log in and prove that they are 18 years old or older. By requiring that makes a huge amount of the user base no longer qualified. Even if they are of age, they might not have a user to log into and have proven their age. And almost always when something gets age restricted, it will plummet in terms of views and also get demonetized. Finally, there is of course the bigoted community. Dealing with so many bigots can be taxing. I've certainly had my own troubles with it, and go through bouts of intense anger and anguish because of dealing with so many dimwits and assholes. But you can leverage their hatred against them through applied history. It's always an uphill battle, but all is not as bleak as it seems. More historians making consistent videos can defeat the trend of disinformation and misinformation, but only if we, as a profession, choose to join the good fight that public history began as. It's a matter of overwhelming the currently winning mendacity of internet jerks with our expertise, by providing that knowledge to those who seek it without barriers. We only have ourselves to blame when pseudo-history gains more traction than actual history. YouTube is better than pretty much everywhere else. By applying history to the present, you can gain an audience for your particular niche. And ultimately, YouTube is where public perception and interpretation is created. If we as a profession refuse to join the fight, we cede territory to misinformation and disinformation. So returning all the way back to the original question, are Americans ignorant of history, or are we refusing to inform them?